You've tuned in just in time for part 5 of Letting Destiny Deliver. Since you've made it this far, it shows that you are putting time and effort into this prescription. I hope that you will put more time and effort into it because the best results are achieved by using the prescription over and over again. The more you use it, the more you will get out of it. With each repetition, you will hear and understand things you hadn't previously. But before we get into part 5, let's return for a minute to part 2, where you took your first step into the larger world of conscious and unconscious mind. It was there that you were introduced to the ways the unconscious mind influences thoughts, feelings, and actions without the conscious mind knowing how or why. The scientific studies on the split-brain patients showed the conscious mind's tendency to interpret things or come to certain conclusions without an appreciation or understanding of what was taking place in the unconscious. These studies clearly demonstrated the problems posed in trying to understand ourselves and others when one mind doesn't know what the other is thinking or doing. It was at that time that a partial solution was offered by identifying 3 obstacles the conscious mind needed to overcome. In case you don't remember, they were 1. The conscious mind's fear and doubt of the unconscious. 2. The need to learn the language of the unconscious. Finally, the 3rd obstacle was learning how to use unconscious competencies in everyday life. Surmounting these obstacles is not only important to improve the flow of information between the 2 minds, but also to break free of limiting belief systems that limit your range of activity and understanding. Needless to say, overcoming these obstacles is not an easy chore, especially since most of us possess little knowledge or insight into how the 2 minds work. This is where part 5 comes in. It is the next step in the process. Part 5 gives you some of the most important tools you will need to overcome the 3 obstacles. Part 5 is useful because it introduces you to the personality of each mind. So not only do we have 2 minds to contend with, we also have 2 personalities to deal with. The conscious mind's personality is driven by the ego, and the self drives the unconscious mind's personality. The ego and the self are separate and distinct entities that drive the flow of information between the conscious and unconscious mind. Therefore, by understanding the nature and personalities of the ego and the self, you can improve their relationship and the flow of information between them. It is no different from 2 people needing to understand each other's personalities in order to improve their relationship as well as their ability to communicate. The ego is the controlling force behind the conscious mind and therefore plays a dominant role in determining what reaches conscious awareness and what does not. It serves this role by deciding what is acceptable and what is not. Simply put, the ego serves as the fantasy police deciding what thoughts go into consciousness and which ones are kept out. The ego is aesthetically driven. It uses aesthetic value to determine the acceptability of information. In other words, if it is pleasing, the ego will want to own it. If it is good, beautiful, right, or interesting, the ego is likely to identify with it. If it is ugly, bad, wrong, or boring, it will want to disown it. Based solely on these criteria, the ego screens feedback, memories, ideas, and concepts for acceptability and ownership. The decisions the ego makes about the acceptability of information is important because it not only controls the flow of information between the conscious and unconscious, but also between the inner and outer worlds.
I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this before.
The selective ownership of information based on aesthetic value can have a real downside if the ego winds up distorting the self by denying, disowning, or repressing displeasing or pleasing parts which must be admitted into consciousness for self-health. For self-health, the ego must be flexible and competent enough to deal with all types of feedback, memories, ideas, and concepts that are relevant to one's sense of self, be they good or bad. If not, it will block or distort the flow of information from one mind to the other, which will lead to confusion regarding the true nature of the self. Since the ego plays a leading role in what you think consciously, it has the power to prevent the unconscious mind from communicating, especially if the ego does not find the unconscious mind's point of view acceptable. Unfortunately, the ego has a tendency to get rid of views or opinions it sees as unpleasant, weak, stupid, crazy, or strange. This means the ego is by and large handicapped by its biases. Its aesthetic bias makes the formidable task of keeping out those things that do not belong and accepting those that do belong even tougher. The ego is the caller ID of the conscious mind as it selectively screens what information it wants to allow into consciousness and what it wants to keep out. The difference between self-health and self-sabotage is effective selectivity. Nonetheless, the ego can only block unwanted but needed information for so long. Sooner or later, it will have to deal with denied, disowned, or repressed material. If for no other reason, because the resentments, insecurities, jealousies, unmet needs, and unwanted thoughts will sooner or later become intrusive, intolerable, or lead to self-destructive behavior. If the ego cuts itself off from valid input, good or bad, it falsifies the self and fails to do its job. Remember, the flow of information between the conscious and unconscious mind is critical for self-health. Therefore, the ego to best serve, it must share control with the self, creating a dual control system. To be healthy, the ego needs to reflect on and process ideas in order to consider other viewpoints and determine how they fit, if at all. Rather than automatically seeing the different, the wrong, the bad, the boring as undesirable and trying to get rid of them, the healthy ego must be able to process them deeper in order to see what value lies in them and then use them for self-development. In addition to its aesthetic needs, one dominant aspect of the ego's personality is to be defensive. After all, its job is to defend consciousness from infectious information. It cannot, however, afford to be so defensive that it blocks nurturing information or distorts self or others. Because the ego has a tendency to get rid of everything it does not want to know, its natural tendency is to disown it, and without realizing it, foist it off on others, thereby distorting self and others at the same time. An overly defensive ego would rather blame and project than take ownership. To adjust for its handicaps, the ego must learn to walk the fine line between defending against distorting input and remaining open to nourishing input, even if it's sometimes hard to swallow. The ego can walk this line only when it is prepared to doubt the absolute rightness of its assumptions, only when it is prepared to embrace the duality of opposing forces. Only then will the ego be able to undergo the kind of self-examination that is empowering. Only then will it serve to further the truth. The ego needs to recognize and accept that the self contains both good and dark potentials. This duality of good and bad, one of nature's most amazing and necessary interactions, is the very thing the ego has trouble dealing with. Most people find it difficult for one reason or another to deal with their darker side. Yet it is the recognition and integration of the darker side that leads to greatness and modesty. It leads to greatness because facing it allows you to turn it into an asset. At the same time, it gives you modesty by reminding you that it can bring you down if you are not careful. Without an ability to look at our own dark side, not only will we distort the self, but our personal relationships will become infected with a general mistrust that produces the suffering that is wrought by misunderstanding. This is because projection, one of the ego's favorite defense mechanisms, dictates the overall quality of relationships and life. Since projection is something the conscious mind does unconsciously or without knowing it, your ego must learn how to tap the unknown self hidden in the unconscious. This is exactly why the ego cannot afford to fear the unconscious with its connection to those things not known about the self by the conscious mind. An ego that can face the unknown and in the process gain access to self-knowledge will be better able to focus on disposing of those things that are toxic while remaining open to those things that are nurturing. To see the bigger picture, the ego must learn to understand and reconcile those things and people it sees as strange and unfamiliar instead of destroying them. Simply put, if the ego does not know the self, it will find it more difficult to make healthy judgments about what is good and what is bad, what is right or what is wrong, what is true and what is false. If the ego is dominating consciousness, it will be at the expense of self-development. A dominating ego will be unable to know and deal with reality because its strict selectiveness leads to distortion and denial. However, if the ego is unafraid to accept the self with its strengths and weaknesses, and at the same time trusts the self's ability to rise to the occasion, there will be an increase in consciousness that opens the door to destiny. When the ego and the self unite forces in this way, the inner core's healthier energy and substance is made available to the ego. The right attitude toward the self positions the ego to serve and use the unconscious in a way that is empowering to both. The ego is naturally attracted to beauty, power, excitement, and invested in having an image it views as desirable. The problem is that the ego can get so caught up in these things of the outer world that it neglects the inner work it needs to do with and for the self. This is why the ego and the self need to form a healthy alliance, so consciousness can select from the many things that bombard it which ones are real, which ones are core, and focus on them, organize them, and integrate them successfully. What I am saying in many ways is that the proper mixture of ego and self must be achieved if consciousness is to have self-health. The ego needs the unconscious to help it identify and stay in touch with the things that are not native to it, such as the higher instincts of spirituality, love, belonging, respect, and individuality. It takes courage and discipline on the part of the ego to meet these needs. This is why the ego cannot devalue them or fear the rejection, shame, guilt, or humiliation they may bring on. Ego at its extreme is greed. When the ego becomes greedy, it has completely lost its connection to the self and the higher instincts. Those who have an ego that is afraid to love or be loved for fear of being hurt or seen as weak are putting themselves in harm's way. This kind of fear blocks from consciousness those feelings of satisfaction, as well as the heightened states that come from love. This is like robbing a plant of water. Without love, the ego develops an I don't care attitude. Not caring only serves to perpetuate an emptiness that no amount of success, greed, revenge, or envy can fill. The I don't care attitude, even though it may protect us from pain, does have a price. The price being an inability to develop a sense of purpose and meaning. Consciousness, when duly driven by the higher and lower instincts of the self and the ego, will have the ability to develop the kind of awareness that effectively counterbalances the forces of tension, fear, boredom, and doubt. If the ego does not recognize and serve the higher instincts, it will get lost in superficial stimulation seeking or in overcompensating for feelings of inadequacy and loneliness. The collective doesn't know that it doesn't know about self-health. That is why, rather than giving you a framework with which to understand self-health, they create a dependence on prescription drugs and escapes that do not work. The collective consciousness centers on solutions like Zoloft, Xanax, Prozac, drugs, alcohol, thrill-seeking, violence, manipulation, or withdrawal. These escapes don't work because they don't change the relationship between the ego and the self, nor do they provide the insights and skills needed to process information in a way that is nurturing to the mind, body, and spirit. Escapes don't satisfy the needs of the inner core. They only offer temporary relief from the tension or pain. To tap the unconscious self, the ego must outgrow the childish stage of consciousness where it wants to turn away from problems or deny their existence, where it wishes that life were simple, certain, and smooth. The ego needs to have the right attitude towards tension and satisfaction, pain and pleasure, in order to transform them into a sense of meaning and purpose. Your ego needs to develop an accepting attitude towards those things or ideas it sees as strange and different. It cannot run from the past by always searching for the new. It must not hide from the future by guarding against the new and different. The ego must not be afraid to embrace the self with its need for growth and development, or its human need to love and be loved, to respect and be respected, to understand and be understood, to have dignity and achieve integrity. If the ego abandons these higher instincts, it will leave itself trapped in a superficial world that only triggers impatience, irritability, indecision, and insecurity. If the ego leaves these higher needs unrealized in the unconscious, it will find itself always struggling with unsatisfied cravings for more stimulation, or feelings of desperation and resignation. A healthy ego is one that is in touch with the unconscious and the environment, and is organizing both in order to maintain an optimal state of balance between the demands of the inner world and the outer world. For example, being in a relationship that is unhealthy in its ability to be loving and nurturing a fair amount of the time must be recognized by the ego as one that either needs to change or end. This also means the ego has to be healthy enough to do something about it. The ego must learn to meet its needs without sabotaging the self. The ego must value truth, even though it prefers its illusions. Understand that what I'm telling you here about the ego and the self is for the purpose of making you more able to manage the relationship between the conscious and unconscious mind. Managing the ego according to this prescription will give you some specific ways of overcoming the three obstacles. Understanding the personalities of the two minds will help you to better understand the language each speaks. Valuing the unconscious self with its higher needs is much more advantageous than fearing it or denying it. I realize this is a lot to take in, but this prescription is formulated in a way that will help with the absorption. Besides that, you can use it over and over again. The ego is invested in being and having the best. It wants admiration, to be attractive, interesting, exciting, to be right, and competent. It especially does not want to be shamed, embarrassed, or humiliated. In contrast, the self is driven to express itself by way of its preferences. These preferences take the form of wants, needs, and desires that emerge from the unconscious, where the seeds of self are transmitting signals to the conscious mind, and which the ego must recognize and respond to. There is so much embedded in the unconscious that is awaiting an opportunity to grow and develop. You see, the unconscious possesses an awareness of self, and it will intuitively push you in the right direction if you let it. It is important then that the ego not get in the way with its rigid mindsets, its doubts, its defensiveness, its need to imitate fad or fashion, or by being too fearful or too fearless. An ego of this sort will sabotage your unconscious awakenings and lead you in the wrong direction. For the ego to have a healthy relationship with the self, it needs to be able to distinguish the real from the pretend. It needs to maintain the proper balance between impulse and inhibition. The ego needs to be careful not to disown, eliminate, repress, or negate many features and sources of genuineness. At the same time, it needs to be aware when it is adding, pretending, or playing roles that are not supported by your authenticity. If the ego is not connected to the self, it will be limited to playing roles in games and mistake that for authenticity. If the ego replaces authenticity with playing roles in games or with too many superimposed controls from the outside, the joy of life will be lost. Instead of experiencing joy, there will be anxiety, depression, compulsive behavior, and physical ailments. The ego must be able to accept the truth. To do this, it must not be overly focused on gaining the approval of others or afraid of expressing how one really feels for fear of rejection, disapproval, or retaliation. The ego needs to be invested in the worthwhileness of being true to oneself, even if it means being different. The ego must be able to internalize both positive and negative feedback when appropriate. The ego must be able to make decisions by tuning into the self and understanding its needs or preferences. The ego best serves the self when it is able and willing to use reflective consciousness to see what is going on without distorting it. The ego best serves when it is able to cleanse away thoughts and feelings that are toxic to the mind and the body. By doing these things, the ego becomes empowered to more accurately perceive self and others, and to assume appropriate responsibility for oneself, if not in action, then in reaction. A healthy ego is able to be psychologically and emotionally intimate in spite of feelings of vulnerability. The healthy ego, when wronged, empowers itself to resolve the matter in a way that allows the toxins to fade in significance rather than dominate consciousness. The unconscious self will surely be strangled by an ego that is rigid and closed. A rigid, closed ego, rather than being open and changing with experience and greater understanding, becomes trapped in a lifelong pattern of behaving or relating in a fixed and rigid manner. Like the body rejects a new heart, even though it will die without it, a rigid ego rejects or is unable to use suggestions or ideas that may be dearly needed by the self. A rigid ego dominates consciousness with mindsets that produce holes in one's ability to perceive. For some, these mindsets prevent them from seeing things any other way, and therefore they have no eyes. Others may be unable to listen and therefore have no ears. There are some that have no heart or no memory. And there are those who do not have a leg to stand on. A rigid ego fills these holes with overcompensation, which throws everything out of balance. A rigid ego loses its means of orientation because it loses its ability to appreciate difference. To function properly, the ego must embrace that which is different rather than condemning it. Without the ability to appreciate difference, the ego can only relate to things that are alike, which leads to rigidity and the same old, same old. A rigid ego says, if you are different, I must weed you out and build walls to keep you out. Familiarity to the ego is anti-confusion, whereas different is strange. Anything familiar takes on a positive connotation, anything different a negative one. The ego separates and discriminates on the basis of familiarity and a lack of familiarity. This helps it decide what is good and what is bad, what it will let in and what it will keep out. However, to truly have self-health, one needs to be able to see things from different frames of reference. This can only come from developing the insight, understanding, and self-knowledge that comes from hard work, experience, and an openness to learning. Only then will the ego's fantasy police be doing justice to the self. The ego must serve a twofold role. It not only has to deal with the outer world, it has to deal with the inner world of impulse and instinct. It must act as a border guard by knowing what to keep out and what to let in. It must be able to separate and unite. Separate and unite, do what's right. See difference, see sameness, stop the insaneness. Separate and unite, let's stop the fight. Enjoy sameness, allow contrast. Don't rush to judgment so fast. It's about you being you and me being me. It's about living in harmony without losing autonomy.
It's deja vu. This moment's happened before.
To serve, the ego must possess the wisdom contained in this prescription so it can be in tune with the unconscious and respond to the needs of the inner world and not just imitate what the outer world tells it to. It must not block or distort the self. The conscious ego and the unconscious self need to have a good relationship with healthy two-way communication. Because of all these things, the ego plays a primary role in self-development and in making that ultimate connection with destiny. This concludes Part 5 of Letting Destiny Deliver. I understand that this is a lot of information for your conscious mind to absorb. However, if your conscious mind is open to the ideas and not putting forth a lot of resistance, your unconscious mind can work on it for you. I know there are a lot of things that you want to accomplish, and your unconscious can work on them, and really work on them. It can work on them at its convenience and work very hard. And 3 months from now, 6 months, 9 months from now, a great deal can be accomplished. Your unconscious can really work on those matters, really work on them. There are a lot of things that you can do. There are a lot of things that your unconscious minds are interested in. And you can really work on them in the next few months, the next 6 months, the next 9 months, the next 12 months. A tremendous amount can be accomplished. And I hope you take a tremendous unconscious pleasure in letting your unconscious mind work on them for you. inner space, the infinite frontier. This is a voyage of story and study fashioned for you. Its purpose, to reveal to you the universe of mind, body, and spirit, to boldly take you where no one has taken you before.